Now, Jim Barclay was born in 1869 at Hastings on the Mornington Peninsula, where his parents had a farm. He left the area when he was in his late teens, moved into the Mansfield district where he lived for many years.
From what we understand, he was a rather large man for the time. He was 6'4" and I think around 14.5 stone. His background was at Hastings, fishing family, but he used to get very seasick, so he left Hastings, moved to Mansfield in his late teens. Started working in the cattle stations and working for himself. He and a partner owned the Bluff lease for quite a few years. So he became from, probably not having much to do with cattle in his late teens to by the time he was in his 40s, he was a very well respected and well-known mountain cattleman and horseman, apparently very talented horseman.
Yeah, right, so he had worked in the area for many years before he ended up down in Wonnangatta.
Yes, he'd been there for 23 years, 24 years in the mountains before he came to Wonnangatta, yeah. That was 1916 when the Bryces sold.
Now, this is roughly the area where Jim Barclay had his mountain hut. It's in the vicinity of Lovick's hut, and Jack Lovick always said that if it's good enough for Jim Barclay to have hut here, we'll build ours here too.
The father and other family members and passed on a hell of a lot of stuff to me about Jim Barclay, and he was a legendary bushman. Don't let anybody tell you anything else. He was a quintessential bushman. There was only one better, and that was Harry Smith, his mate. But if you go back to Jim Barclay, he built a hut where Lovick's hut is built right now on Barclay Saddle. It's still called Barclay Saddle by the noted people and the knowledgeable people. And my old man always said, if Jim Barclay built a hut here in the early 1900s, this would be the place where we'll build our hut to muster our cattle. Yeah, absolutely.
That certainly shows a fair, decent amount of respect for the man, yeah, if that's the case.
These people were legends of the high country, absolute legends of the high country. And their feats were well recorded. Badly that it ended for Jim the way it did. But my father became Jim Barclay's son, young Jim, his best friend. So there's an absolute family connection all the way through. And I've never seen my father as comfortable anywhere in the bush as on Barclay's flat.
Saying a lot for the man then, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I won't go into the fact that my grandmother said he was the greatest dancer she'd ever seen at the Merrijig Ball.
Is that right?
Yeah, so we won't go there, but he was probably a ladies' man as well, but never let it be said that he wasn't a bushman that could back that up.
Jim Barclay, how local was he to this area here in the Harcourt Hills?
Jim Barclay was a local. He had a hut just down here near Fry's Flat, very friendly to Mansfield people and related to some of the Mansfield people, and very well regarded and a very, very good bushman. He was in partnership with Jack Bullock, and they ran cattle on the Bluff and Kingbilly for many years. Jack Bullock went away to the war, and Jim Barclay was murdered while Jack Bullock was still at the war. But they were very, very good bushmen, good cattlemen. And then, of course, Jim Barclay went to Wonnangatta to work, and that's where he met his end.
So would they have been sort of the first sort of cattlemen to roam those high plains with cattle in those areas?
They were sort of, but there were people there before. The Klingsborns and the Wares were there a little bit before that as well, and Frank Lovick. So all around that time there was some very old names that were running cattle out on the Bluff, Kingbilly, Mount Clear and the Jamison River.
So what information, Bruce, has been passed down to you from that you can tell us about Jim Barclay?
I kept asking my grandmother a bit about the story. You could hear bits and pieces of people talking about it. And I asked her one day, I was 14 or 15 or so, and she must have thought I deserved being told a bit more. And it's the first time she said to me, we sat down up at home there and she said, oh, a cousin of hers arrived here just not long after the war, and he was a great friend of Barclay's. And he wanted to find a good friend before he went away, and he hadn't seen him since the war, come back from the war and found out that he'd been murdered. So he arrived here on horseback from Melbourne and wanted to find out what actually happened, or if he could find something out. So he stayed the night up at my grandmother's here, and they filled him up with a few supplies and things, and off he's gone. And I think she said 2 or 3 months later he arrived back here and stayed the night and a bit more supplies to get back to Mansfield. And the question, she said, well, what did you find out? And he said, well, he's a bit reluctant to say anything, but in the end he just said to her that justice had been done. And I've heard that before, and that's all she said to me, that's all he said to her, and then he stayed the night, didn't talk about much else and left, and she didn't see much of him after that. But that's the thing that comes out of it, is justice has been done, and you could throw that around anywhere, really. I don't know.
Jim Barclay was a man I believe was a true bushman, but he didn't start that way. He came through, like a lot of people, had to go out in the bush and learn life out there. It's not like a lot of people have said that he was a man who was born to the bush. He wasn't. But he became, based on all the knowledge we have of all the things he did in his life, he certainly felt comfortable in the bush, he understood the bush, and he worked well in the bush. He worked well with horses, he worked well with cattle, and of course, part of the problem may be he worked very well with women.
Keith, I've read that Jim was a bit of a ladies' man. What do you know about that?
Yeah, he had a bit of a reputation as enjoying a party and a dance, and the ladies' man thing I've certainly heard. It could quite possibly have been true. We do know that he did get married, so he obviously wanted to settle down at some stage. He married Lizzie Catini, who originally came from Jamison, and they had a son, James, which was forever known as Young Jim. But unfortunately, Lizzie died a few months after the birth of consumption, which we now call tuberculosis.
Now, after Lizzie died in 1911, she was brought here to the Mansfield Cemetery, where she was buried in this unmarked grave. The Hearn family helped Jim out by looking after his son. 3 years later, he moved to the Melbourne suburb of Vermont to live with Jim's sister Molly. After the death of Lizzie, work continued to fill Jim's life. And around April 1915, Arthur Phillips offered Jim the position as Wonnangatta Station Manager.
The job of managing Wonnangatta Station suited Jim Barclay. He was a man, I believe, very comfortable with his own company, and being on his own and running a cattle station like that, he was quite happy to do. At one stage he employed a woman, a Mrs Wilson, to cook for him, but he wrote in a letter to his sister that he ended up putting her off. She talked far too much for him.
So did Jim sort of spend most of his time on the station, like he did, travel in and out a great deal?
Yeah, he'd work, I'd say, 11 months of the year on the station. He used to look forward to his trips to Melbourne to see his son, but he'd have to arrange that around work and when, you know, the station was all set. And he'd often have stockmen from Glenroy come and help him. And once all the mustering was done and all the cattle were gone, everything was settled down, he'd catch the train, he'd ride to Mansfield or Stratford and catch the train to Melbourne and stay with his sister, visit his son.